The little carrot slices on the lunch tray seemed to be openly mocking the awkward predicament the two of them had stumbled into. Jace rubbed the bridge of his nose and, with a few swift moves, ate every last one of them. He cleared his throat softly and changed the subject. Right. That guy just now, Zach Zhu, is in the Model Aviation Club. We're building a custom UAV. It's really interesting. He looked at Sol. What about you? Are you in any clubs at school? Sol slowly shook his head. Jace was patient. He lowered his voice a little and asked again, why don't you like hanging out with people? It was a question that had puzzled Jace for a long time. When he first noticed Sol, he just thought this person was gloomy and introverted, always alone, completely unintegrated. He'd assumed that was just Sol's personality. But later, seeing things from the cat's perspective, he realized that at home, Sol wasn't like that at all. He was clearly lively, cheerful, hyperactive, and talkative. So it seemed that Sol was simply unable to express his true self in front of others for some reason. He wasn't trying to pry into Sol's private life. He just couldn't help wanting to help him, just a little more. After Jace asked, Sol was silent for a very long time. So long that Jace thought he wouldn't answer at all. Then, hesitantly, Sol lifted his head. His beautiful dark eyes were timid and evasive. Because. Sol's voice was very small, but he still tried hard to complete a full, long sentence. I get really nervous when I talk to people. So it's really hard to start a friendship. A social disorder influenced by psychology and emotion. Jace nodded slightly. But then he thought, Sol isn't like that at all with dogs and cats. Nervous or not, the very first time he met the cat, he'd scooped it up and taken it home, bathed it, fed it, talked to it, cuddled it to sleep, and rambled on endlessly. So it was a social disorder that only applied to humans? He was choosing his words carefully, wanting to ask more, but before he could open his mouth, he heard Sol quietly add one more sentence. Also, I have really severe face blindness. I can't recognize people clearly. At those words, Jace's brow furrowed very slightly. He lowered his eyes and was lost in thought for a moment. This was the first time Sol had ever discussed these things with anyone outside of his therapist. And the person was his crush, no less. Seeing Jace stay silent, Sol's hands immediately clutched the hem of his shirt. It felt like a tiny Doraemon bamboo copter had been plugged into his heart, suspending it high in the sky, and he had the constant feeling that the next second, the copter would lose power and his heart would plummet to the ground and shatter into minced meat. What's happening? Why isn't he saying anything? Frowning? What does frowning mean, Aya? Does he think I have some kind of mental illness or a weird teenage syndrome? Or does he not believe I have face blindness? But I really do have face blindness. Or does he think I have too many issues, social anxiety and face blindness, and he's about to revoke his offer of friendship? Crap. I knew I shouldn't have been so honest with him. Honesty is a killer move, but total honesty is a suicide move. What should I say to salvage this? Should I tell him I was lying? Sol. Completely immersed in his own internal world, Sol didn't hear Jace call his name several times. It wasn't until Jace reached out and waved a hand in front of his face that Sol snapped back. He stared wide-eyed at Jace, swallowed nervously, full of apprehension, waiting to receive Jace's disgust and criticism. But unexpectedly, the angle Jace came from was one Sol had never even considered. There was a hint of a smile in Jace's eyes as he asked, "But why is it that you can recognize me?" That heart of Sol's, dangling from the bamboo copter, spun 2 circles at the speed of a blender on high, then slowly, spiraling, drifted back down. His heart was pounding. He opened his mouth. Closed it. He had no idea how to answer. Was he supposed to say, "Hello, my dear. Allow me to explain. There are 2 reasons I can recognize you despite my face blindness." Subjectively, it's because I like you. Objectively, it's because you are just, ridiculously handsome. Soul's face burned red. The hem of his shirt was about to be torn to shreds by his own hands. Fortunately, Jace didn't seem intent on pressing the question to the end. Or perhaps he saw Soul's acute embarrassment and tactfully changed the subject. It's okay. You don't need to worry too much. Being nervous or having face blindness doesn't change who you are as a person. He still wanted to encourage Soul to try socializing on his own. He continued, slow and steady, most of our classmates are really nice. If you reach out a little, people will want to be friends with you. It was unclear whether Soul actually heard him. His head was practically about to dip into his plate. After a few seconds, he said, very quietly, like you? Jace didn't react in time. What? It was as if Soul had finally gathered his resolve. He lifted his head and looked at Jace. The blush on his face hadn't faded, and his voice held a faint, trembling edge at the end. Probably because he wasn't used to direct eye contact, his gaze flickered away, uneasy. Like how good you are. So good that you were willing to buy me soda when we were practically strangers. So good that you were willing to be my friend when no one else paid me any attention. So good that you helped me hand out cookies on the field trip. So good that you eat with me at school and listen to me talk. Soul felt a warmth spreading in his chest. It was like a fluffy cat was lying there, its soft, tiny hairs sweeping and brushing back and forth, giving him a surge of boldness he would never have had before. This boldness urged him to look straight at the person in front of him. To let his gaze stop wavering. To stop being afraid. To stop hesitating. He had read many books on normal social interaction. He knew that expressing thanks after accepting kindness was a necessary social ritual. So Soul took a small, deep breath. He looked at Jace and said, with deep seriousness, thank you. For talking to me first. Thank you for being so good. The two of them had looked at each other before. But this time was distinctly different. For the first time, Jace was face to face with Soul's unguarded gaze. Because his hair was pushed back, those eyes were completely unobstructed. Dark and bright, like stars in the rain, they stared at him without blinking. His face was flushed pink, even his ears were pink. He was biting his lips slightly from nervousness, both hands clenched tight on the hem of his shirt. He looked like someone who had just summoned every ounce of courage, full of anxious anticipation. It was as if the world had suddenly been hit with a pause button. The people around them froze. The sounds vanished. And a terribly ill-timed thought popped into Jace's mind. Soul Bennett was actually, maybe a little too cute. A long time, or maybe just the briefest of instants, passed before Jace finally snapped out of it. The paused world unpaused and moved forward. The first sound that returned was the sound of his own heartbeat. Jace had a premonition. He was probably not going to be able to sleep again tonight. Lunch finished. Jace headed back to the dorms. Passing the school's vending machine, he didn't forget to buy a drink for Soul. The campus had mostly emptied out, open and vast. The sun was bright. Soul, clutching his newest collectible, walked slowly home, replaying the utterly exquisite lunch in his mind. The wind rustled the monthly exam honor roll posted on the board. Soul stopped and spent a moment seriously admiring Jace the academic god's outstanding ranking. Then he spent another moment admiring the outstanding face of the academic god in the little 2x3 photo next to it. He used to stare at Jace's picture like this a lot. He'd even once had the thought of secretly stealing the photo when no one was looking. But that night, he dreamed that a police officer driving a tank had surrounded the school to arrest him for the theft. He woke up terrified and never dared to try. He still remembered the officer in the dream pronouncing his crime, "You dare." The photo of Jace Whitmore is to be admired from afar, not trifled with. For your intent to possess it, I sentence you to 50 years of eating carrots. Soul had woken up drenched in a cold sweat and had believed it with all his heart. The police officer wasn't wrong. Back then, that really was how Sol had felt. Even though he liked Jace so much, he'd never thought about anything actually happening between them. He'd never thought about chasing after him. He'd never even thought about initiating a conversation with Jace. His courage and his ability to interact with others had long since been tossed into some forgotten corner. But now, things were a little different. Sol thought, Jace Whitmore had, on his own, chosen to become his friend. For the first time, Sol felt like he was a rather greedy person, always wanting more the more he got. He felt like just being friends wasn't enough. He wanted to get a little closer. The courage he'd never had before, the courage he'd thought he'd never, ever be able to have, Jace had given him that. The wind kept blowing. Sol's eyes moved from Jace's photo and landed back on the honor roll. Next to that #1 ranking was a very impressive score. Sol counted on his fingers. He would have to work incredibly hard just to not trail too far behind Jace. Falling in love really did affect your academic attitude. For example, here he was, actually wanting to study hard just to get closer to Jace. And so, that afternoon, Sol didn't go home. He returned to the empty classroom alone, rolled up his sleeves, and prepared to go to war with his test papers. Bright light streamed in through the windows. A slightly chilly autumn breeze blew the curtains beautifully. In the silent classroom, there was only the faint, soft scratching of pen on paper. Just before afternoon classes began, Sol finished exactly one math practice test. He let out a long breath, straightened his back, and lifted his head. The moment he capped his pen, he felt the pride of a warrior sheathing his blade. He glanced at the answer key. Wrong. Wrong. So wrong, so wrong. Furious, Sol crumpled the test paper into a ball, fully intending to destroy it. After thinking it over, he decided to take it home and feed it to the cat. Because he hadn't gone home at noon, Sol found himself missing the cat especially after school let out. Besides, so much had happened today. He was like a soda bottle that someone had been shaking vigorously. If he didn't let off some steam, he was going to explode. Wait for the elevator. Go up. Scan his fingerprint. Open the door. Sol burst through the door at top speed, tossed his backpack in the entryway, and like a national team gymnast, leaped across the room in 3 bounds, landing right in front of the cat. He scooped the cat up and began spinning. The cat, having just finished drinking its milk, was nearly spun into throwing it all up. The cat roared furiously, meow. Sol gave it a deeply emotional hug, then took a deep breath and launched into a lightning-speed monologue. Cat, you have absolutely no idea what happened today. Jace Whitmore, like some mysterious video game NPC, magically spawned at the subway station right under our apartment building. And he brought me breakfast. And he said he wants me to forgive him for being mean to me before. He told me not to hate him. Holy crap, how could I hate him? That night, Jace couldn't sleep again. He had grown familiar with this. Whenever something involved Sol, insomnia was the normal state. Closing his eyes, he replayed the scene from tonight, Sol being hugged by everyone. He felt he should be happy, but he couldn't deny that what rose from deep inside him was an inexplicable sense of loss. It didn't contradict his hope that Sol would become more open, that he'd have more friends. He had always known Sol deserved to be liked by everyone. It was just that Sol's gaze had started to turn toward many other people, and that truly brought him a disappointment he hadn't anticipated. Why was that? Jace racked his brain, feeling this was harder to solve than any test, any problem on any exam. And then, Jace couldn't help thinking of something else. Tonight, in Sol's long, overnight chat with the cat, not a single sentence so far had mentioned him. The daily confessions from before had stopped. Because he got home so late, Sol was busy eating, showering, and doing practice tests. It was nearly 11 by the time he finished everything and crawled into bed with the cat. He hugged the warm cat and rolled back and forth on the warm bed, then buried his face in the cat's fur and took a deep breath. Closing his eyes, he sighed with emotion. Never thought I, Sol Bennett, would have a day like this. Cat, tonight when everyone hugged me, I was super happy. It felt like everyone was so close to me. That old feeling of being shut out by the world just vanished instantly. The club president, the little junior girl, Zach Zhu, and the red-haired guy, they're all especially great. They don't make fun of my introverted personality. I'm so lucky to have met them all. The cat meowed lazily. Sol suddenly fell quiet again, but the smile hadn't faded from his face. He rolled over and held the cat up in front of him, his dark eyes bright and sparkling. Meeting Jace, that's the luckiest thing. I like him. A little more than before. Jace, tossing and turning, suddenly froze mid-turn. In the unlit room, he blinked slowly, heat creeping up his cheeks bit by bit. It seemed Sol hadn't gotten over it. In fact, it had gotten worse. What was he supposed to do? He took a deep breath and buried his face in his hands. Fine. Sleep first. Tomorrow, he still had to wait in line to buy Sol breakfast. Strange. This time, he actually felt like he could fall asleep. So the next day, Sol got to eat delicious fried buns again. He was a little embarrassed. He lowered his head and repeatedly rolled a small stone under the toe of his shoe before finally lifting his eyes to look at Jace and stammering, "You're always buying me breakfast. It's too much trouble for you. Next time, maybe just." He wanted to say, "Next time, maybe just skip it." Even though student Jace was enthusiastic, friendly, and happy to help, even though the fried buns were fragrant with thin skins and generous filling, even though he was immensely grateful and happy to accept, if this kept up, it really was too embarrassing. Why on earth did Jace bring him breakfast every single day? Was that logical? Did alien brain circuits have bugs too? They were just friends. This kind of behavior, bringing breakfast every single day, clearly happened more often between couples. Like that tragic, lovey-dovey couple in his class. Today the guy bought the girl fruit pancakes, tomorrow the girl got the guy milk and bread, feeding each other with deep, devoted affection, all sweet and sticky, exchanging glances that seemed to last an eternity. The way those two looked at each other was just like the way Jace looked at him. Ha! Wait, no. Sol felt his mind stutter. He pressed a hand to his forehead. Oh no. Staying up late was making him hallucinate. Believing Jace had feelings for him. Ha. Better to just study how alien brain circuits could glitch. What's wrong? Seeing him sway a moment ago and then raise a hand to his forehead, the smile in Jace's eyes vanished. He frowned and quickly reached out to support Sol's arm, his tone full of disapproval. Low blood sugar again. I told you before, you have to eat something before leaving the house in the morning. If you don't have time, at least eat some candy. Without another word, he used his other hand to gently pinch Sol's cheek, tilting his face up to observe his complexion. Luckily, it wasn't too pale. There was even a very faint layer of pink. Relieved, Jace casually pulled a piece of chocolate from his pocket, unwrapped it, and popped it into Sol's mouth. Only after he'd done it did he think to check the wrapper. 70% dark chocolate. He immediately froze, crumpling the foil into a ball with a rustle. He quickly looked down to observe Sol's expression. I didn't notice the flavor. Is it bitter? Sol, who had been frozen in place like a tree with his soul floating somewhere above, slowly came back to himself. He shook his head slowly, almost as if in slow motion. No, not bitter. He swallowed the chocolate in his mouth. His mind was full of the image of Jace pinching his cheek and looking into his eyes just now. He hesitated, then said, it actually seems kind of sweet. Jace smiled, very faintly. He didn't say anything else, just ruffled Sol's hair. Okay. Hurry back and eat your breakfast. Their classrooms were in two different directions. Just before they parted, Jace seemed to remember something and turned his head. Also, don't feel embarrassed. I'll keep bringing you breakfast tomorrow. Back in his classroom, Jace sat at his desk and stared blankly at the perfect score math test that had just been handed back. He let out a soft sigh. He felt his behavior and thoughts lately were like a tangled ball of yarn. The direction and goal were so clear, yet what he ended up doing was always a knotted, twisted mess. This super academic god decided to spend 15 precious minutes of morning reading time sorting through his own actions properly. Originally, he had only wanted to be friends with Soul, then naturally get invited to Soul's house and bring his cat back. Clearly, he was more than halfway there. Given his current relationship with Soul, if he suggested visiting Soul's home, Soul definitely wouldn't refuse. But the problem was, he didn't want to do that anymore. More precisely, he didn't want the connection between him and Soul to disappear so quickly. One soul, two bodies. As the soul's main body, Jace could synchronize all the senses of his feline offshoot. The cat stayed by Soul's side, rubbing against his legs, nudging his head against him, being held in Soul's arms and petted. It could see Soul's beautiful eyes curving up in a smile. It could even smell the faint scent of shower gel on Soul's skin. Jace felt he kind of liked this feeling. No, he speculated with strict caution, it must be the cat who liked this feeling. Just wait a little longer, Jace thought. He'd just let the cat stay by Soul's side for a while longer. And so, Soul discovered the cat seemed to be getting clingier and clingier. After December passed, the weather grew colder and colder. Winter had truly set in. The snow was especially heavy this year. It fell every couple of days, and a thick white layer always blanketed the world outside the window. Soul's favorite thing was taking a hot shower after school, then wrapping himself in a small fleece blanket and curling up on the sofa by the floor-to-ceiling window, leaning against the little table to do his homework. Whenever this happened, the cat would very obligingly jump onto his lap and lazily curl up into a ball. But Soul was no longer the Soul of yesterday. His grades had improved considerably now. He could barely scrape the cutoff for a top university. Ambition instantly ignited, Tsinghua, Peking University. He was ready to study until his hair fell out, to tie it to a beam and jab his thigh with an awl to stay awake, to bore a hole in the wall for light, to rise at the rooster's crow and dance with a sword. Even having an orange cat in his lap couldn't shake him now. He'd only pet it twice, perfunctorily, then continue. Frowning, chewing his pen, and staring at geography problems, racking his brain. Why do people in location A export mangoes to location B? The answer is because people in location A don't like mangoes. What the heck? The cat started rubbing its head against his cheek. Why are blood oranges so popular in the Chinese market? Because red represents joy in China. What the heck? The cat began wrapping its tail around his hand. Why is kelp dried on pebbles? Because drying it on sand is too dirty. What the heck? Soul slammed his pen down in fury and rolled up his sleeves, feeling an urge to throw hands with the person who wrote the test. At that moment, the cat climbed onto his shoulder and started licking his hair. What are you doing? He used both hands to lift the cat down and stared at it in deep frustration. Lately, the cat had been rubbing and clinging to him every day, and not only that, it had started really liking to lick his hair. Weird. Right. What did it mean when a cat licked your fur? It couldn't be like those insane geography questions, with some reason he'd never guess. So Soul decisively pulled out his phone, lay on the sofa, and started typing into the search bar while getting his hair licked. What does it mean when a cat licks your hair? The web page quickly displayed all sorts of answers. The most eye-catching one said, cats lick fur to assert dominance. A high-status cat will groom a lower-status companion because it feels it is the boss here. What? Outrageous. Absurd. This was a complete inversion of the natural order. Soul, in disbelief, furiously grabbed the cat, furiously glared at the cat, and furiously licked it back. He had to show this cat who was the real boss around here. At home, just as he lay down in bed, Jace inexplicably felt a strange sensation, like his cheek had been licked. He immediately sat up, his expression blank. It was a long moment before he slowly touched his burning hot face. Did that count as a kiss on the cheek? It counted, right? He considered it for a moment and ruled, this was Soul kissing him. The cat rubbed against Soul's legs. The cat nuzzled Soul's face. The cat licked Soul's hair. Jace said that was the cat's doing, he couldn't control it. But he also knew that even though the main body and the offshoot seemed distinct, human and cat clearly separate, they belonged to the same soul. Their subconscious loves and hates were wholly aligned. The cat liked staying by Soul's side because Jace also liked staying by Soul's side. Even if he himself had never paid it any attention, his heart and soul had already focused for him. That night, Jace, stubbornly convinced he'd been kissed, had a rare dream. In the dream, he went back to a year ago, when he and Soul were still distant classmates who brushed past each other's shoulders. The school was always a packed sea of people, students in identical uniforms everywhere. But Jace knew that no matter when he turned around, he would always see that pale, thin, gloomy, and introverted boy. The other was so quiet. It seemed he would never have the thought of stepping forward to greet him. He only kept the distance he himself had marked, following from not too far, not too close. Never daring to look at anything but Jace's back. Like a small animal cautiously poking its head out from some dark, damp corner. Back then, Jace hadn't paid it much attention. Or rather, he thought he hadn't paid it much attention. He'd received too much attention growing up. Soul's gaze was just the most subtle, restrained one among hundreds and thousands of looks. It clearly shouldn't have been noticed. But the truth was, this gaze was the most enduring. Logically, that kind of staring and following should have been annoying. But Soul only watched. He wouldn't even take one step closer or say one extra word. Jace found he truly couldn't get angry. So he let him be, treating it like having one more small shadow trailing along. Perhaps school life really was just that boring. Or perhaps Soul himself was simply too different from everyone else. So occasionally, Jace found himself observing in return. Although he had a cold personality, his relationships with people were good. Even without deliberately putting thought into these small matters, it was easy enough to learn the other's name. Soul Bennett. Jace silently repeated the name once. It felt so wildly inaccurate. The light and warmth of Soul, the sun, were nowhere to be seen on Soul Bennett. This person was clearly more like a breeze in the deep night. Cold. And quiet. Jet black hair. Round eyes that would show a flicker of panic when looking at someone. Skin pale from staying indoors too long. A frame made to look even thinner by an oversized uniform. The originally one-way attention had, at some unknown point, gained a reverse direction. While Soul silently, quietly, like a shadow, watched Jace, Jace answered him with his own attention. Paying attention to someone was like planting a seed in your heart. The power of nature couldn't be underestimated. Whether it was fertile soil or barren land, carefully tended or casually tossed aside, wherever the seed fell, it began to take root and sprout. This feeling was so strange, Jace thought. He had absolutely no intention of paying attention to Soul. Yet, at some point, whenever this person appeared in his line of sight, it became very difficult to notice anyone or anything else. His eyes would unconsciously land on Soul. Watching him eat alone made his heart uncomfortable. Watching him crouch down to play with a stray cat made him think it was cute. Watching Soul follow behind him made him want to buy Soul a drink, just like the impulse to feed a stray cat on the street. Over time, the tree in his heart, the one named Soul Bennett, grew more and more lush with branches and leaves. Jace suddenly remembered a picture book he'd read as a child. A line from the book said, "This kind of seed, if you discover it too late, you will never be able to clear it away." It will take over the entire planet, its roots piercing straight through. The longer he spent observing Soul, the more curious Jace became about this introverted, quiet young man. At school, other guys would throw their arms around each other's shoulders and skip class to play ball. Girls always walked hand in hand with their best friends, even needing to go to the bathroom together between classes. Even the shyest people had one or two close friends. But whenever he saw Soul, this person was always alone. During PE, Soul would sit quietly by himself under the school's camphor tree, staring motionlessly at the grains of sand on the ground, as if immersed in another world entirely. At lunch, Soul never shared a table with anyone. He always carried his tray alone, dodging the crowds, and ultimately sat down in a small corner of the cafeteria, finishing his meal without a single word. On the way home after school, he had no companion either. He just walked his own path, step by step, head down in silence. The sunset would stretch Soul's shadow out so long and thin, swaying in the dimming wind, looking a little pitiful. The more Jace saw, the more an uncomfortable feeling settled in his heart. That lonely, out-of-place mood seemed contagious. Just watching made him feel bad for Soul, as if he felt it himself. Maybe Soul needed a friend, he thought. Jace didn't consider himself a particularly warm person, but he wasn't cold-blooded either. It didn't matter if Soul was introverted and timid, not liking to talk. He could be the one to initiate, eating together, walking to and from school. It wasn't anything terribly difficult. So once, when Soul was again quietly following behind him, Jace passed a vending machine and paused for half a minute. He bought a bottle of water. Peach flavor. He'd seen Soul drink it a few times before. He probably didn't hate the taste. The cold bottle pressed against his palm. Jace lowered his eyes and waited for a moment. He'd planned to wait until Soul got a little closer to say something. But after he turned around, he was surprised to find someone had already gotten there first. An unfamiliar guy. Looked like he was probably Soul's classmate. He'd hurriedly blocked Soul, seemingly having something to say. But Soul instantly dropped his head lower, instinctively taking a large step back. His hair covered his eyes, his face pale, his colorless lips pressed tightly together. It was a very classic posture of resistance and avoidance. Condensation from the cold can had already dampened Jace's palm. He frowned slightly, his dark eyes fixed on the two people not far away for a moment. He suddenly realized he might have misread the situation. It didn't seem like everyone was rejecting Soul. It was Soul who was rejecting social interaction with everyone. For someone like that, an abrupt approach might be an awkward, unwelcome intrusion. So his original plan to proactively reach out was scrapped. That bottle of peach soda was eventually left on a table until it reached room temperature, and because he didn't like drinking it anyway, it was thrown away. Even though he couldn't really talk to Soul, Jace still thought of him from time to time. It wasn't with any complicated or intense emotion. This awareness, just like Soul himself, simply existed there quietly, like an invisible person, yet one Jace couldn't ignore. At school, he couldn't help looking. At home doing homework, his mind would occasionally drift. The third time Jace unconsciously wrote Soul's name on his scratch paper while doing a math test, he decisively put his pen down, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and sighed. Turning his head, the cat beside his desk was dozing in its bed. Jace reached out, stroked its fur, grabbed it by the scruff, and lifted it onto his lap. He rarely talked to the cat. Partly because the cat didn't have much intelligence, and he wasn't childish enough to chat with a pet. On the other hand, he understood clearly, one soul, two bodies. Any mood he had could be sensed by this little offshoot. Like right now. Thinking of Soul, all alone, the cat had looked up, eager and ready to try, as if it also wanted to complete that interrupted greeting. Human beings always hem and haw, hesitate, and agonize for all sorts of reasons. They can never truly follow their heart's desire. But a cat can. A cat is just a cat. A cat just a tiny bit smarter, filled with a sliver of a human soul. Whatever it wanted to do, it had to go do it immediately. So the cat ran away. Ran to downstairs of Soul's building. Got scooped up by Soul, taken home, and decided, this is great. The cat never wanted to leave again. A person cannot control their own heart. Just like Jace couldn't control his cat. Tonight, the snow was falling thick and heavy. The cat and Soul were bundled under the same thin blanket, skin pressed close to the warm fur. The cat, drowsy, had begun to purr softly in its sleep. Soul gazed absently at the snow swirling in the beam of the street lamp outside the window, and a feeling he'd never had before suddenly rose up. Anticipation. Anticipation for tomorrow. For a very long time before this, he had always felt he existed independently outside this world. All the people and events seemed separated from him by a faint layer of fog. Day after day, nothing was interesting. But now things were different. Soul thought, he was starting to feel that every tomorrow was extraordinarily beautiful. His conscience stirring, Soul decided not to drag the nearly asleep cat into an all-night marathon chat session. Instead, for a rare change, he went to bed early with the cat. The next day, he woke up extra early, full of energy. He did a round of morning exercises following a radio broadcast at home. He made breakfast for the still sleeping cat. He even made a packed sandwich to bring to Jace as breakfast. Soul Bennett, a good youth born under the red flag and raised in the spring breeze, emphasized that mutual exchange and grateful repayment were the proper way of friendship. Trudging through the fresh snow all the way to the school gate, Soul was in a very good mood. The morning wind was biting. His scarf covered more than half his face, and his exhaled breath misted his vision. From afar, he saw Jace approaching. He walked a few steps closer to him, pulled the scarf down from his face, then shook the insulated bag in his hand and said the line he'd rehearsed several times in his head, "Jace, you don't need to buy me breakfast today. I brought a sandwich." Saying a complete, fluent sentence to someone else was, for Soul, no small progress. He immediately gave himself a 5-second mental round of applause. But Jace didn't answer. Puzzled, Soul looked up. He saw Jace freeze the instant their eyes met, then very quickly turn his head away. His earlobes were tinged with a very distinct, faint red. Jace? The person across from him finally turned back to look at him. His gaze paused for half a second on Soul's lips. Then he suddenly seemed very uncomfortable and raised a hand to touch his own cheek. Soul hesitated. What was this? Was the wind too cold? His face was so flushed he looked sick. Soul decided to just take off his own scarf and hand it to Jace, along with the insulated bag holding the sandwich. He hesitantly spoke up, asking, "Are you sick?" Jace took the items from his hands. The breakfast, he accepted. The scarf, he wrapped back around Soul's neck. As he wound the scarf, the two of them inevitably drew a little closer. Soul could almost see the faint shadows the other's eyelashes cast on his face. The warm fabric was once more wrapped around him by those hands. Soul felt like he'd been hit with a bodybind curse. He didn't snap out of it until Jace had finished rewrapping the scarf. He heard the person before him answer his earlier question. Sick. I guess so. Jace thought, something was definitely not normal. Soul was about to get over it, but he himself was showing symptoms of catching it. That morning was 4 straight periods of math. 2 periods of specialized function training. 2 periods of intensive geometry practice. Normally, Soul would have put a good 3 steps of distance between himself and this, burying his head in his book to doze. But perhaps his recent mending the sky style of studying was paying off. He was surprised to feel like he could actually step into the ring and exchange a few moves with mathematics. So he went all in, single-handedly starting a hack and slash through 2 large math tests. Confidence, 500%. Accuracy, 50%. Dizzy from the effort, Soul collapsed onto his desk. So annoying. After the gathering ended and he got home, Jace didn't do anything. He just sat silently at his desk, occasionally rubbing his forehead, thinking, so annoying. He didn't know where this tangled ball of yarn feeling came from. It hadn't been like this when he was walking to the restaurant with Sol. It hadn't been like this when he was peeling crab for Sol either. Jace replayed everything in his mind, bit by bit. His frown deepened. He very precisely identified that the problem did not lie with him. Nor with Sol. The person with the problem was clearly Darren Zhao. Finding the correct answer didn't make the irritation in his heart disappear. Instead, thinking of Darren made it worse. He didn't even need to recall, the guy's offenses lined up in his head on their own. Always interrupting his conversations with Sol. Forcibly wedging himself into their lunches. Taking it upon himself to peel crab for Sol. And attempting to steal the shrimp Sol had peeled for him. Jace took a deep breath. The accumulated anger in his chest flared. He thought, this person Darren Zhao is utterly, unapologetically criminal. But, wait. When you got down to it, Darren's actions were all about becoming friends with Sol. Jace's frowning expression instantly froze. Darren wanted to be good to Sol. Why was he angry? Jace felt the tangled yarn in his head hadn't unraveled with the pulling of this one thread. Instead, it had tied itself into a complete dead knot. He recalled every frame. The pen he held casually in his hand unconsciously scratched across the scratch paper. But when he looked, it was all Sol's name. Someone was blocking his contact with Sol, and he found it an eyesore. Someone was trying to replace him in being good to Sol, and he felt dissatisfied. Someone wanted to take away what Sol had intended to give him, and he felt angry. All these messy emotions gathered together, forming a very unfamiliar combination. Sour. Oppressive. Furious. Jace didn't understand what this was. He looked down at the messy characters of Sol Bennett on the paper. His heartbeat in his chest grew faster and faster because of these Chinese characters made of horizontal and vertical strokes, dots and dashes. Why was he unhappy because someone else was attentive to Sol? And why did these negative feelings dissipate when he thought of Sol? Jace felt the answer was right on the tip of his tongue. He buried his face in his hands and let out a long breath. Then, he heard Sol ask, "Hey. Were you jealous?" Jace's heart gave a violent pound. Jealous? The cat didn't know what jealousy was. Jace didn't know what jealousy was either. Jace kept his original posture, but he could clearly feel the skin touching his palms getting hotter and hotter. He tried his best to think calmly, jealousy. If he understood correctly, it meant the jealousy that arises when someone's beloved interacts with another person. His beloved was Sol. He was angry because he was jealous of Darren. Could that be it? The cat, refusing to admit jealousy, was grabbed and kissed by Sol. Jace, refusing to admit jealousy, felt his ears burn. His racing heartbeat was the final, unappealable verdict, telling him plainly that this matter had no room for argument anymore. In the process of waiting for Sol to get over it, Jace had caught the same incurable affliction. He was certain. He liked Sol. What was he supposed to do when he liked someone? Jace sorted through his feelings for a long time, until late into the night, still without a trace of sleep. Instead, he turned on the light and picked up his pen. This academic god, accustomed to planning ahead, wrote quickly in his notebook. 1. Must date. Set aside time over the weekend to familiarize with the rights and obligations of a boyfriend. 2. Must tutor Sol, get into the same university. At least the same city. 3. Sol won't like the dorms, so after starting university, must live off campus. Curtains should be light-colored. Pajamas must match. Bed sheets, duvet covers, etc. 4. Propose domestically, honeymoon abroad. Tentatively take Sol to see the northern lights. 5. Kids take his surname. Names. That last item, Jace crossed out. He'd almost forgotten they wouldn't have children. But that was also very good. They could raise some dogs and cats later. Sol looked like he'd really like that. After making a grand blueprint for their future married life and love, Jace suddenly realized something was off. It seemed all these beautiful plans needed to satisfy the same prerequisite: he had to confess first. Confessing, of course he had to confess. After all, they'd already kissed. The cat was a part of him. How could Sol kissing the cat not count as kissing him? It was just that Jace had absolutely no experience in this. To be cautious, this academic god, accustomed to preparing thoroughly before any class, began searching for related materials online with a rigorous attitude. The result was that he found most people said a confession should only be made when you were 100% sure the other person would say yes. Otherwise, a rash confession would put them in an awkward position. It was an extremely impolite, presumptuous act. Pursue them? Jace pondered for a moment and found it very reasonable. Even though he knew Sol liked him very much, that had nothing to do with him needing to pursue Sol. Precisely because Sol liked him, he should put in even more care. So Jace opened the search page and started taking notes in another notebook. That night, one person wrote like the wind, the other slept soundly. During the day, Sol had buried his head in hard study at school. At night, he'd been ravaged by social hell at the restaurant. After getting home, he'd been busy taking care of the cat and Curly. Master Sol, having been busy all day, threw himself onto the bed the moment he finished preparing 2 servings of cat food and fell straight asleep. He dreamed a chaotic mess of river gods all night. So much so that the next day, his alarm went off 3 or 4 times, and he still couldn't get up. In the end, the cat couldn't bear it anymore and jumped onto the bed, batting him awake with a paw, then tossed his phone onto his face with a thud. What time? Holy crap, 7 o'clock. Sol, who had been in a daze, was instantly scared wide awake the moment he saw the time on the screen. He sprang up like a carp leaping out of the water, dashed to wash his face, brush his teeth, and throw on his uniform. His movements were so fast they left afterimages. He took the cat food he'd made last night from the fridge to heat it up, and didn't forget to remind, "Cat, remember to take care of Curly at home." After saying this, he grabbed his backpack, waved goodbye to the 2 cats, and sprinted downstairs. In the few dozen seconds the elevator took to descend to the first floor, Sol made a precise calculation using his outstanding mathematical ability. The result he derived was, as long as nothing unexpected happened on the way, he could perfectly clock in at school just in time. Excellent. Sol pumped his fist like SpongeBob. I'm ready. He crouched down to tie his shoelaces tight, deciding that the moment the elevator doors opened, he would bolt for the subway station at Usain Bolt speed. But in reality, the moment Sol ran out of the stairwell door, he was completely unprepared to be pulled aside by someone. The person caught his wrist. Unable to retract his forward momentum in time, he lost his footing and crashed heavily into them. Who was it? Who was this? Sol rubbed his sore forehead, his face burning with anger. In broad daylight, what Lu Ban master was casting a grab-and-pull ultimate on the main road? What was the benefit of taking the head of a high school student? But the next second, a familiar voice came from above him. Jace looked at him with some concern, his gaze gentle. Sorry. Did I hurt you? Sol blinked in confusion. Huh? Was he not fully awake yet, or had the impact knocked him stupid? Why was Jace here? Move your hand. Let me see if you're hurt. Sol, having absolutely no idea what was happening, stood there and watched as his crush, who had inexplicably and miraculously spawned at the bottom of his apartment building, took hold of his wrist, pulled away the hand covering his forehead, then brushed aside his bangs and very seriously inspected the spot where he'd bumped. In this position, the 2 of them were too close. The other's warm breath could gently scatter against his skin. Sol stood there, completely at a loss, before belatedly remembering to explain. It's nothing. It doesn't hurt much. He didn't need to look to know his face was definitely red all over. He wanted to pull back a little, but Jace pressed the back of his neck. Don't move. It's a little red. The other looked down at him. Even though there was no expression on his face, you could tell his gaze was very soft. Let me blow on it. Then it won't hurt. Huh? Blow. Blow on what? Who was blowing on whom? Sol felt like a gear in his brain had jammed due to overheating. He instinctively held his breath. Then he heard Jace seemingly chuckle very softly. The other cupped his face, leaned in close, and gently blew on his forehead. Like an untouching kiss. His heart slammed. Blood rushed to his cheeks. Sol really couldn't take it anymore. He jumped a full half-meter away and quickly pressed the back of his hands against his face. He didn't need a mirror to know how red his face was right now. Oh no, oh no, oh no. If Jace saw, how was he supposed to explain? Say he'd put on too much blush, or that he was allergic to him. But blushing was a normal human thing, could he really be blamed for that? Because this was seriously a bit too ambiguous. His thoughts were a tangled mess. Sol decided to find a subject to change the topic first. He quickly looked up at Jace. Well, why are you here? It's on my way. I wanted to walk to school with you. The academic god Jace, having prepared extensively, almost instantly recalled the first item listed in the pursuit strategy notebook he'd written all last night: must strive to create opportunities to be together. Walking to school together, that counted as being together, right? Even though the theoretical knowledge was perfectly in place, when it came to actually executing it with Sol, Jace realized he couldn't be as smooth sailing as he'd imagined. He thought again of the moment just now when the two of them were so close, Sol's damp, dark eyes and slightly trembling lashes. He was clearly so nervous, yet he still looked at Jace with those utterly adorable eyes. Jace's heartbeat unconsciously sped up a few beats. Huh? Sol looked over and tilted his head slightly, puzzled. Why was Jace blushing, too? Had he put on too much blush, or did he have allergies? Besides, Jace said it was on his way. Didn't Jace's house be on the north side of the city? How could this be on his way? So was Jace actually directionally challenged? Sol discovered that Jace was very different today. Incredibly different. He suspected the aliens had sent a third Jace, somewhere between good Jace and bad Jace. The changes weren't drastic compared to before, but certain things seemed to have become more openly, unmistakably obvious. This Jace would look at him so gently. Would blow on his boo-boos. On this winter morning, the fog was so thick you could barely see anything white, and this person still reached out his hand, asking if Sol wanted to hold it. Was this logical? Did this make any sense for an alien? Was Jace his crush, or was he Jace's crush? But Sol still couldn't resist the temptation. He held on. The visible fog flowed around them like a river. The distant buildings and pedestrians were all hidden in a hazy mist, impossible to see clearly. This gave Sol the feeling that only he and Jace were left in the whole world. They were so close, shoulder to shoulder, hands tightly clasped, palms transferring warmth to each other. Sol's heart pounded like a drum. At that moment, he wanted so badly to say something. Like, to tell Jace he was really happy right now. He really liked holding hands. But he didn't dare. He just walked forward slowly with Jace, hoping this road could be a little longer. Wait. He seemed to have forgotten something. Sol suddenly stopped in his tracks. He slowly lifted his head and looked at Jace, his expression shifting to one of horror. He spoke, one word at a time, "We are probably late." The two of them ended up trading a romantic morning for a searing, soul-crushing scolding from the dean of students. According to school custom, students who were late in the morning had to stand in the disciplinary office for the entire morning study period. The academic god Jace, excelling in both character and studies, was naturally a first-time offender. Sol was a first-time repeat offender. The two of them stood side by side, completely out of place among the group of classmates who were so sleepy they couldn't even open their eyes. The dean, phone in hand, spittle flying, was reciting life lesson prose to them with painstaking, well-intentioned fervor. Youth should be full of vigor. Don't be in a daze. High schoolers must treasure your time. Don't waste it. Late to school today, destroy the world tomorrow. Sol looked at Jace beside him. He thought about how this academic god usually entered and exited the disciplinary office only to receive awards, never having endured this kind of bizarre humiliation. He immediately felt a little guilty. He blinked and whispered, "It's my fault for leaving too late. I dragged you into this." But as soon as he said it, Jace's eyes curved. "You didn't drag me into anything. Being late with you makes me happy, too." Ever since that day they were late together and punished by standing, Sol discovered that the dynamic between him and Jace seemed to have really started to change. They still ate lunch together, still did practice tests together, just like before. Occasionally walked to and from school together. But it was as if something hazy had started to become clear. Like the sun emerging, the fog lifting. Sol couldn't figure out where this change came from. He racked his brains for days and finally decided to transform into Sherlock Sol and investigate thoroughly. He found an old hat at home, held a chocolate stick in his mouth like a pipe, and clutched a magnifying glass in one hand and the cat in the other. He said in a deep voice, "Meow son, what do you think?" The cat was very confused. "Meow. I mean, what do you think about the fact that Jace has been waiting for me downstairs every day lately to walk to school together?" Sol solemnly took a drag of his chocolate and spoke seriously. "Through my investigation, I've discovered that coming here from his house is absolutely not on the way. So why does he travel all the way over here every day just to walk with me in the morning? What exactly is his purpose?" The cat fell silent, pretending nothing was happening and licked its paw. "Meow. Also, he ruffles my hair. When it snows, he says the road is slippery and holds my hand. 3 times a week, he tells me I'm cute." Sol's face involuntarily flushed again. He crunched through the rest of the chocolate stick and hugged the cat, murmuring quietly, "Okay, fine. He's ruffled my hair before. Holding my hand when the snowy road is slippery is also highly forgivable. Calling me cute can be attributed to his high EQ and good character. Looking at it this way, all of these things are perfectly reasonable. But I just feel like it's not the same as before. It's very different. When we look at each other." Sol's voice grew smaller, his eyes sparkling. "He looks like he might like me a little." Sol remembered that day. The night before, heavy snow had fallen all night. The next morning, the fog was thick. Jace was already waiting for him downstairs. The feeling of knowing someone was waiting for you was magical. Especially when that waiting came from an unspoken understanding between two people, it was like a piece of cream cake placed in front of you before it was time to eat. The scent, the color, the sweet taste of the cake had already plucked the strings of your heart hundreds of times. Sol's heart was racing. He was afraid of making someone wait too long. After getting ready, he hurried downstairs. Even the short few steps from the elevator to outside the stairwell door made him run until he was panting and flushed. His scarf was wrapped in a messy tangle, and his hat covered more than half his face, almost obstructing his vision. But Sol didn't care. He was distracted, thinking about how to greet Jace in a moment. The energetic anime boy version, "Ohio, Jace-kun. Today is also a day of liking you incredibly much." The ancient style, deeply affectionate version, "Brother Jace, even standing in the snow, you are so dashing. Trudging through the snow with you is truly a great fortune." The Socialist Brotherhood version, "Coming to wait for me in such heavy snow, you're a true brother. Come, brother, let's hug and speak some heartfelt words." Soul scratched his head. He felt his face, buried in the scarf, grow even hotter. He rounded the corner and looked up, and the silhouette of Jace standing outside the stairwell door came into view. Soul's heart raced faster. He was about to quicken his steps to go over, but he was walking too fast and didn't see the path clearly. The moment he stepped out of the stairwell, his foot slipped, thud. He slid and fell straight to his knees, right in front of Jace. Completely failing to register what had just happened, Soul found himself kneeling on the ground, his face barely 5 centimeters from the hem of the other's coat, practically pressed against it. Confused, he looked up. He met Jace's eyes. His entire being turned to stone. Cracked. Shattered into dust. Ha, ha, ha. Great. Might as well just die. Not the anime boy. Not the ancient romance. Not the socialist brotherhood. So it was the servant paying respects to the emperor. What could be more embarrassing than performing a grand kowtow to your crush first thing in the morning? Face ashen, Soul was helped up by Jace. Expressionless, he watched the other crouch down in front of him and seriously brush the snow off his clothes, then look up at him with concern. How were you so careless? Did the fall hurt? Soul slowly shook his head. He had no more worldly attachments. His body didn't hurt from the fall. But other things had long since shattered. For instance, his heart. His dignity. And the image he had painstakingly, meticulously built in front of his crush. He might as well have just knocked himself unconscious from the fall. If it doesn't hurt, why are you making that face? Jace stood up and reached out to straighten the messy pile of Soul's scarf. He couldn't resist ruffling his hair. You don't look happy at all. No. Soul wanted to cry but had no tears. Could anyone who pulled a stunt like that in front of the person they liked first thing in the morning still smile? The fact that he wasn't smiling was simply because he was, by nature, not a smiley person. Okay. He bit his little handkerchief internally, eyes full of glistening tears, ready to bang his head on the ground. But before he could wail, he felt someone take his hand. The road is very slippery. Soul looked up in surprise. He saw Jace looking down at him intently, the tips of his ears slightly red, his eyes holding a very clear smile. Can I hold your hand? That way you won't fall again, huh? Was this a reward for performing the grand kowtow? Thank you, your majesty, for your grace. Soul hurriedly shook his head, shaking the nonsense out of his brain. Hold. Why wouldn't he hold? This was what he deserved. He reached his hand over. But this time was different from any time they'd held hands before. Jace's warm hand covered his, pressing palm to palm. 10 fingers intertwined. Cat, don't you think this is a little too ambiguous? Soul rolled back and forth on the rug at home. Seeing the cat curled into a ball, pretending to sleep and ignoring him, he poked the cat's belly with the magnifying glass. The great Sherlock Soul has discovered you're faking sleep. Get up right now and tell me, why on earth is Jace acting like this? Soul lay on his back on the rug. The floor heating behind him was at a perfect temperature, warming him comfortably. He closed one eye and used the other to look through the magnifying glass at the neat row of soda cans in the liquor cabinet. His tone was full of incomprehension, or could it be that within the scope of normal social interaction, you also hold hands if you have a good relationship? Does he still just see me as a friend? The cat stirred beside him, leaned in close, and meowed, sounding like it was in the negative. Okay. The hand-holding, I'll reserve judgment for now. But besides that, these days he's been giving me little gifts every day. When he looks at me, his eyes are always smiling. Being with Jace, it's like stepping into some strange magnetic field. Even though it's invisible, there's definitely something resonating on the same frequency. Soul scratched his hair. Cat, do you know that feeling? It's like two opposite poles of a magnet attracting each other. A magnet's pull is mutual. So this strange, ambiguous magnetic field, surely I'm not the only one who can feel it, right? The more he spoke, the faster his heart beat. He didn't know if it was because the floor heating was too warm, but his cheeks flushed, too. But facing the cat's eyes, Sol took a deep breath. The answer was clearly right in front of him, yet he suddenly flinched back. Like a student who had prepared meticulously for an exam, but before the test paper was handed out, always had to predict a low score to manage their expectations. Of course, I can't just casually conclude that this means he likes me. Human relationships are so complicated. I've never been very good at telling what's what. But Jace has always been so kind. Maybe the way he's acting now is just treating me as a good friend. He must be this good to other people, too. The cat jumped up, let out a meow, and left. Over the next few days, Sol didn't get to eat the delicious fried buns. Because winter break was approaching this week, many shops outside the school gate had closed, including that perpetually long-lined breakfast spot. But he didn't feel disappointed, because the new breakfast Jace brought him, fresh cream croissants, was also very delicious. Freshly baked, fluffy bread with sweet cream, plus a cup of hot cocoa just right for warming his hands. Even the cold morning became warm. In the early morning chill, Sol struggled to pull his scarf down halfway and took a big sip of hot cocoa, feeling his whole body come back to life. The sweet taste of chocolate spread across his tongue. He turned his head to Jace beside him and sincerely expressed his thanks. "You're so nice." One word at a time, his attitude serious, his tone reverent. But Jace frowned slightly. As if remembering something, he suddenly raised his hand and pressed the back of Sol's neck, keeping him in that upturned, eye-to-eye position. The cold wind, carrying a thin frosty mist, blew Jace's bangs. Those dark eyes were like a deep pool covered with a thin layer of ice. But when they looked at Sol, gentle ripples stirred on the surface. Beautiful. Too handsome. Sol swallowed. He was hit with the dazed debuff by the person's looks for 3 seconds, completely missing what this person was doing. What was he mumbling about? Couldn't understand. Wanted to kiss. Jace poked his forehead, a little helplessly. "Are you listening to me?" "Huh." Sol finally snapped out of it. His beautiful, round eyes were full of clear, pure foolishness. "I just said, you don't need to tell me I'm nice." Jace repeated it, his expression very serious. "I wouldn't bring breakfast to anyone else. I wouldn't tell anyone else they're cute. I have no interest in buying gifts for anyone else. Not even friends." The sound of the wind seemed to stop. The world became very quiet. Sol unconsciously held his breath, his cheeks burning. All he could hear beside his ears was Jace's voice. He heard Jace say, "Can you understand? Sol. I'm not this nice to other people. It's only to you." Jace's words, "I'm not this nice to other people, it's only to you," were etched into Sol's brain. All day, he was dizzy and dazed because of that sentence, savoring every single word meticulously in his mind. His heart pounded wildly. When he got home, he forced the cat to listen to him recount it no fewer than 10 times. By the 11th recount, the cat couldn't take it anymore and turned to flee, but was swept back into Sol's arms by his quick hands. This time, I can't be overthinking it. He was like a student who'd been leaked the exam questions by the proctor before the test, never so full of confidence. This is being ambiguous, right? This has got to be ambiguous, right? The cat drawled, "Meow," meaning, "You finally figured it out." Because of his excitement, Sol went to bed very late that night. It was deep into the quiet night. The cat, curled into a ball of fluff, had long been fast asleep. The lights in the high-rises outside the window had grown sparse. He still couldn't sleep. Humans were truly strange creatures, and human feelings were even more complicated than the hardest math problem. He thought, clearly, back when it was just a one-sided crush, he'd always fantasized about the day Jace might also like him. But now that there were actually these hints, he'd suddenly gotten timid, a desire to avoid rising up. The heating in the house was set too high. Sol's face burned. His heart pounded, so noisy he couldn't settle down to sleep. What was he supposed to do? He couldn't help starting to bite his nails. Having a crush, he was an expert at that. You just had to quietly like them. Very safe. Very low effort. Very free. But being in an ambiguous situation, he had no experience. His crush had evolved into an ambiguous interest. How was he supposed to keep talking, eating, and hanging out with Jace now? Sol felt he was a very greedy person. Before, when Jace didn't like him, it was fine. Now that he'd received a little, he was constantly worried about whether he'd done something wrong, whether he'd made this little bit of affection decrease. The great military strategist Sun Tzu once wrote in The Art of War, "If you encounter a matter you can't decide, escape first." Sol believed in it deeply. It just so happened that these past few days were the end of the semester, and everyone was busy with final exams. So he could uniformly use the excuse of too busy studying to decline all of Jace's invitations. Walking to school together in the morning. Eating together on Friday. Walking home together in the afternoon. Sol dodged them all. Sol deeply felt this was a wise move. Because right now, the moment he thought of Jace, his face turned red and his heart raced. And then, thinking that Jace might also kind of like him, his face turned completely red and his heart raced rapidly. In this condition, if he had to be around Jace, he probably wouldn't last 3 minutes before heart bubbles started bursting out of him. No. Better to quickly do 2 more math tests to recuperate. 2 days without seeing Jace wasn't too unbearable. Even though he missed him a little, because he was in the middle of finals, Sol's attention was still mostly occupied by exams. Every day, it was nothing but studying and testing. It wasn't until the afternoon of the 3rd day, when the bell rang to collect the last test paper, and Sol, his head spinning, looking like all the life force had been drained out of him, walked out on unsteady legs. But the moment he stepped out of the exam room, he saw Jace waiting outside. Thump, Sol's eyes widened. He heard his heart pound hard. The life force that had just been sucked away by the exams immediately rushed back. Why are you? He wanted to ask, why are you here? Didn't you have an exam? But it was too noisy outside the exam room with all the people. Jace didn't answer. He just took Sol's hand and pulled him outside for a stretch of road before explaining, I turned in my paper early. Sol, who had barely managed to finish just in time, was silent. Academic God, the time you didn't need, you actually could have given some to me. He tried to understand the academic God's line of reasoning. Why? Because I wanted to wait for you. Jace didn't walk forward anymore. He stopped, lowered his eyes to look at Sol. There was a hint of unspoken meaning in his eyes, like a very intimate reproach. But his tone was very soft. Otherwise, you'd be avoiding me again. Ever since he'd said those words last time, Sol hadn't walked with him anymore. Jace had thought about it without figuring it out, and could only attribute the problem to him not handling the measure right. This time, having finally caught him, he looked at Sol, seriously observing him for a moment before asking, is it because you hate me again, that you don't want to see me? Sol's face turned red again. Internally, Sol was going crazy. He couldn't understand why this question also came off so ambiguous. And why did he have to say, again? He'd never hated him. Okay. I don't. Jace looked a little better. You don't what? Don't hate him, or don't not want to see him. Sol lifted his eyes to him and said quietly, neither. At the root of it, he was just a little embarrassed. That evening, Vesper Song again gathered everyone for a meal. Because she wasn't planning on coming to school next semester, and there wouldn't be many chances to hang out together later, this meal was eaten under an especially gloomy atmosphere. Especially the club president. She had a bit to drink, and was crying noisily, saying she was about to go study somewhere so far away and couldn't bear to leave her friends. Parting was an unavoidably heavy topic at 17 or 18. Sol had never before experienced that, can't bear to leave, kind of feeling over parting, because, to him, everyone was the same. New or old, it made no difference. But now. He lifted his head and looked at the people across the table. Vesper Song, Zhak Zhu, KCG, and Darren Zhao. These were all his special friends. He couldn't bear to leave them. Of course, the person he was most reluctant to part with, was Jace. Would Jace also be reluctant to part with him? Sol didn't know. He lowered his head and looked at his glass. The low-alcohol fruit wine showed a very pretty color under the light. He'd drunk quite a bit earlier, and his head was a little fuzzy. In a blink, he saw the color of the wine in the glass darken. It turned out Jace had reached over and was idly covering the mouth of his glass. "You can't drink anymore. It'll give you a headache." This person took his glass away and replaced it with a can of fruit juice. Sol looked over, very slow. His skin was pale, and a little low-alcohol wine made his face appear very flushed. His dark eyes were very moist. When he looked at people with that bewildered air, he looked very innocent. Very obedient. Jace stared at that person for 2 seconds, spending a great deal of effort to suppress the urge to pinch Sol's cheek. He let out a breath and asked softly, "Which city do you want to go to for university?" Sol hesitated for a moment. He'd never thought about this question before. Later, he'd felt that as long as he could be a little closer to Jace, anywhere was good. But he couldn't exactly say, "I want to stay by your side." Sol shook his head, meaning he hadn't decided yet. He pressed his lips together and asked Jace in return, "What about you?" "Me?" Jace smiled very lightly. His dark pupils looked at Sol without blinking, his tone very natural. "I want to be in the same city as you. So we can still eat together every day after this." Jace's words hammered into Sol's smooth brain, one character at a time. He widened his eyes, processing for a very long time in a daze, suspecting he was completely drunk. Otherwise, why could he understand every single word, but when they were strung together, he couldn't comprehend what they meant. Want to be in the same city as him, what did that mean? So they could still eat together every day after this, what did that mean? Was what Jace meant really what he thought it meant? The Detective Conan case-solving BGM blared passionately in his head. Magnifying glass in his left hand, chocolate bar in his right, Sherlock Sol finally understood that line, "When you have eliminated all which is impossible, then whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." So, Jace really did kind of like him. Actually, it wasn't just kind of like. It seemed like he liked him a lot. That evening after he got back, Sol, knocked silly by the pie falling from the sky, floated around hugging the cat and giggling foolishly for a long time. He even wanted to forcibly drag the cat into dancing their wedding opening dance. The two speakers in his house alternated left and right, one singing, "Today is a good day, the things on your mind can all come true," the other singing, good luck, wishing you good luck brings joy and love." Way too noisy. The cat pressed its paws over its ears. It couldn't hear clearly what Sol was saying, but it could see Sol's face was very red, his eyes bright and sparkling. "Jace said he wants to go to university in the same city as me. Turns out he's already thought so far ahead about the future." Sol covered his face with his hands. His palms could feel the very high temperature. Oh no. He seemed to like Jace even more now. At the same time, Jace sat at his desk, took out his planning notebook, and began adding and editing again, item 23. For the 10th anniversary, must go back to the high school together, revisit the old haunts, and reminisce. Presents must be bought. Back when it was just a one-sided crush, Sol didn't think too much. Just seeing Jace every day was enough for him to entertain and satisfy himself. But now it was different. He thought, now it wasn't just his own wishful thinking. Now it was mutual. When two people liked each other, it was like two chemical substances just missing one condition to react. They were only missing a confession, and then they could date. Sol took a deep breath and, in 3 seconds, made a momentous decision: he was going to confess. To him, this seemed like an insurmountable task. How could someone who struggled just to initiate a conversation go and openly bare his heart to another person? But the fact was, making the decision was actually as easy as turning over his hand. Even he himself found it strange. Probably because he'd had too many words before that he'd never been able to say out loud. So this time. The most important time. The one he couldn't afford to miss. He absolutely had to say it bravely. The matter of confessing was classified by Sol as a top-secret level 1 mission. He didn't tell anyone, not even the cat. He secretly prepared for several days on his own, buying flowers and also preparing a gift. The gift, Sol chose for a very long time. He rejected countless alternatives before finally selecting the paintings he'd made of Jace. Drawing could be considered one of Sol's few talents. Before, when he was alone with nothing to do, bored, he'd liked to doodle. Clean lines, fresh colors. It was the kind of skill where, if posted online, it would draw a crowd. But he'd never shown anyone. Later, when he started developing a crush on Jace, the subject of his idle drawings all became this person. The side profile he caught glimpses of during meals. The fleeting glance on the sports field. The other's serious expression the first time they spoke. Sol felt he hadn't drawn all that many. But scattered bits, accumulated over time, actually made a thick stack. The internet said, the most important thing about a confession gift is that it carries enough weight of feeling. Sol weighed his stack of drawing drafts in his hand. He wasn't sure if this counted as feeling, but it was definitely heavy enough. To show how much he valued it, Sol even specially carved out time from his precious study schedule to frame those pictures. Afraid the clumsy cat would scratch them, he simply locked them, along with the flowers, in the study. The winter sun streamed through the large study window. The drawing papers, piled and hung unevenly on the wall, swayed gently in the breeze, making crisp sounds. Dazzling light flickered on the paper. The roses delivered from the flower shop downstairs hadn't been arranged into a bouquet yet, casually sitting one bucket here, another bucket there. They were freshly bloomed that morning, colors vibrant, fragrance rich, droplets of water on the verge of falling but not quite, almost as if about to soak the drawing paper into a pastel pink. Sol stood at the doorway. The invisible fragrance wrapped around him. He took a deep breath and solemnly gave himself a 3-minute round of mental applause. Romantic. Too romantic. He was simply a genius. Sol decided the drawing drafts and roses should stay arranged exactly as they were, untouched. But that led to another problem: he had to invite Jace over to his house. Winter break had already started. The previous advantage of walking to school together every day no longer existed. If he wanted to see Jace, he had to take the initiative and invite him. In his entire life, Sol had rarely done anything like proactively asking someone out. The number of times he'd initiated a conversation could be counted on his fingers. He had zero experience in this area. The difficulty level of asking someone out was equivalent to telling a wild, unenlightened forest man to pick up a pen and calculate a celestial orbit. Sol paced back and forth, from the study to the living room, then from the living room to the balcony, almost wanting to bash his head against the floor. So, how exactly do you ask your crush out? He roamed the house. Seeing the cat lounging on the balcony, leisurely sunbathing, he couldn't stand it and forcibly grabbed the cat for some harassment, rubbing his face back and forth against it. He even launched a psychic attack, rambling without pause: I want to see Jace so bad, want to see Jace so bad, want to see Jace so bad. I haven't seen him in 2.5 days. 1 day apart feels like 3 autumns, that's already 7.5 autumns, woo-woo. The cat was incredibly annoyed by the noise. The cat attempted to flee. The cat did not succeed. It just had to let Soul wipe his tears on it and sigh, puffing out its chest, meaning, human, you may lean on the cat's mighty shoulder and cry. Soul cried and wailed until he was tired, then began to place his hopes on metaphysical means. He poked the cat's forehead. If only you were some kind of cat god. Casually cast a little magic, and I could see Jace. The next second, his phone on the table rang. Jace, how have you been feeling studying and doing practice tests these past 2 days? Any parts you don't understand? Jace, if there's anything you don't get, you can ask me. Messaging or video calls are both fine. But it seems like neither is quite convenient enough. Jace, so, want to meet up tomorrow? Soul gaped, his face full of disbelief, his eyes instantly lighting up. He quickly replied with a single word, okay. Then he took a deep breath, turned around, lifted the cat, and looked at it with reverence. Oh, cat god above, please accept this believer's bow. The cat, baffled, meow. Soul produced some little dried fish as an offering. Actually, I have one more wish. He was blushing a bit, but his eyes were still sparkling. It would be even better if, tomorrow, Jace could come home with me. Mew. The two's first official date location was a cafe near Soul's place, each with a math practice test. Before heading over, Soul had been a little nervous, searching online for ages about what to do when meeting an ambiguous interest. Once there, he discovered that actually, he didn't need to do anything. Just doing practice tests was enough. But today, he really couldn't calm his mind enough to deal with those annoying functions and geometry problems. Right now, his head was completely full of how to get Jace back to his place so he could confess. So, an hour passed. Soul had done only a few scattered problems on the test in front of him. Soul floating somewhere above, he stared at those symbols, his pen doodling aimlessly on the scratch paper. It wasn't until Jace, across from him, stood up and sat down next to him that Soul snapped back, frantically pretending he'd been studying the problem. But the test paper was already pulled away. Let me see. Jace quickly scanned the few problems Soul had written in a chaotic mess, his brow furrowing very lightly. Soul's heart jumped. He suddenly felt like a student whose unfinished homework was being spot-checked by the teacher. He stammered, Oh no. It seemed like he hadn't gotten many right. Smart people liked hanging out with smart people. With that expression on Jace's face, was he thinking Soul was stupid? But Jace didn't say anything. He just very naturally ruffled Soul's hair. What don't you understand? Let me explain it to you. Then, he looked at Soul very seriously, his tone gentle but carrying an unquestionable certainty. We already agreed we're going to university in the same city, right? Soul's face immediately turned red. Right. Fortunately, Soul had made great progress recently. On regular math tests, he could now hover around a passing score. Occasionally, with good luck, he could even score in the 90s. Now, to avoid his crush thinking he was an idiot, he put in 120% effort. The wrong answers plus the remaining half of the test paper were gone over in just over an hour. The answer sheet was filled up completely, the answers both neat and good-looking. Soul deeply felt he had completely conquered mathematics. He raised his eyebrows and exhaled, also forgetting all about confessions and embarrassment. He only felt a proud, satisfied sense of achievement bubbling up from the depths of his heart, as if the next second he'd be on a podium receiving an award. Tiny math test, so easy to handle. Jace wouldn't think he was an idiot now, right? Actually, I knew how to do all these. He clutched the test paper and turned his face to Jace beside him, mustering his courage to prove his IQ level a bit. But because they'd been leaning in together to look at the problems, the two were very close. Jace's bangs even brushed against Soul's cheek. Their eyes met. Eye to eye, they could see their own reflection in the other's gaze. The word soul hadn't finished died in his mouth. His dark pupils very clearly trembled. The sound of a heartbeat, crisp and distinct, could be heard. He didn't know whose it was. Close. Too close. Jace's skin was so flawless. His eyes were beautiful. The shape of his lips was beautiful, too. They looked very kissable. Soul's face instantly turned scarlet. His brain was stuffed full of nonsense. He froze in place, not knowing whether to pull back or what. But he still managed, in that split second, to think, if this were in a comic, pink bubbles would definitely be popping out above both their heads right now. So ambiguous. He felt a long time had passed, but in reality, it was only a few seconds. Jace smiled. This time, it wasn't the very faint smile from before. It was a very distinct one. The faint dimple on his cheek showed. He was replying to Soul's unfinished sentence from earlier. Especially smart. By the time they left the cafe, it was dusk. Winter days were short, and dusk vanished in the blink of an eye. When they first stepped out, there was still a warm, yellow-tinged darkness in the sky. After walking just a few steps, it was completely pitch black. Only a golden-orange crescent moon hung on the horizon. Neither of them said they should split up first. They just strolled 3 laps around the nearby pedestrian street like that. Soul, outwardly expressionless, was internally so frantic he was rolling on the ground. What to do, what to do? Today was almost over, but he still hadn't managed to issue the invitation. It was so cold. They couldn't walk a 4th lap on this street. What reason could he find that would seem both reasonable and foolproof? Say, I'm a really good cook, would you like to try? That seemed a bit too forward. Say, I still have 2 practice tests at home I don't know how to do, could you help? That looked like he was getting a free tutor. Say. They passed a cat cafe. Kittens on the cat tree inside the glass window were bouncing around energetically, raising their little stubby paws to bat at cat toys. A flash of inspiration struck Soul. He suddenly had a brilliant idea. He guaranteed no one could refuse it. So he turned to look at Jace, expression solemn, demeanor grave. Would you like to come to my place and hang out? He swallowed and seriously upped the ante. My cat can do backflips. The walk from the pedestrian street to Soul's place only took about 10 minutes. They passed the frozen fountain and the evergreen shrubs in the apartment complex. The elevator doors opened, and with a ding, closed again. The sleek walls mercilessly reflected the 2 of them standing side by side. Soul was a little nervous, his hands repeatedly twisting the cuff of his sleeve. He'd never had friends before. He never imagined the first person he'd bring home would be his crush. Well done, Soul. He let out a soft breath, mentally applauded himself, and began to rehearse in his head the words he wanted to say in a moment. Jace beside him called his name several times before he snapped back. And so, Soul, just as he reached the first line of his confession rehearsal, was interrupted by a completely oblivious party. He met Jace's eyes. His lashes trembled. His face turned entirely red. What is it? Which floor? Jace tilted his head down, his eyes holding a smile as he looked at him. What are you thinking about? You didn't even press the elevator button. Soul. He quickly scanned his access card and stammered an excuse. I was thinking, how many backflips to make the cat do? The dozen or so seconds in the elevator seemed to stretch endlessly long. Being out in public was one thing, but once they stepped into this small, sealed space with just the 2 of them, the ambiguous feeling grew, drop by drop, like it was secretly multiplying, coiling tightly around Soul. So the moment the elevator doors opened, he immediately darted out at high speed, hanging up his coat, getting slippers, pretending he was very busy. The warm air inside chased away all the cold clinging to them. Soul wasn't very clear on how to host someone. He paced back and forth in the living room like a Roomba, one moment bringing out a fruit plate, the next boiling hot tea. In the end, Jace pressed him down to sit. No need to go to so much trouble. Soul stiffly shook his head. It's no trouble. When people were nervous, they would pretend to be very busy. If you didn't let him pace, he'd get even more nervous, okay? The two sat in the living room, looking at each other. Soul wasn't someone who knew how to bring up topics. His brain spun at high speed, thinking about how to start. But his eyes landed on the cat bed in the corner of the living room, and they lit up. He'd almost forgotten. There was still the cat. And so, the cat, who had been soundly asleep, was scooped up by Soul and forcibly booted up. In ancient times, King Yu of Zhou lit beacon fires to fool his vassals for a beauty's smile. Today, Soul coerced and coaxed an animal into performing tricks to lure Jace home. The cat, woken halfway through its sleep, was very irritable. It bared its teeth, glared, and bristled. Soul hurriedly crouched down, reached out to poke the cat, and lowered his voice, speaking sweetly to it, "Quick, cat, do 2 backflips. I'll give you little dried fish tonight." The cat, irritated, swished its tail and ignored Soul, turning its face away. Oh no. Soul thought, Jace isn't going to think he was lying, is he? But his cat really could do backflips. Soul, clearly a little embarrassed and at his wits' end, crouched on the floor and didn't get up. He looked at the cat, then at Jace, looking rather pitiful. Jace's heart softened at the sight. He just had to sigh softly